I still remember the way his voice sounded that morning, flat, impatient, almost bored, as if he were asking me to pass the salt instead of demanding the last of my life savings. "Mom, I need you to clear this," my son said, sliding a thick folder across my kitchen table. $300,000. It's Fernanda's debt. Don't let me down. I stared at the bold red numbers on the first page, the kind that punch you straight in the chest. For a moment, I couldn't even breathe. My own son. Not asking, not explaining, expecting. As if my entire existence had boiled down to one purpose, paying his way out of trouble. It wasn't the amount that broke me. It was the look in his eyes. Cold. Calculating. Detached. I searched his face for the little boy who once clung to my leg when he was afraid of thunderstorms, but that child was gone. In his place stood a man who saw me not as his mother, but as a bank account with a heartbeat. Dear listeners, before I tell you how everything unraveled, and how I eventually vanished from their lives without a single goodbye, please subscribe to this channel so you never miss stories like this one. I promise, what happened next changed everything I thought I knew about family, loyalty, and survival. When I looked up again, he was already scrolling through his phone, tapping the table with restless fingers, waiting for me to agree. He didn't ask if I could afford it. He didn't care that it was nearly everything I had left after a lifetime of sacrifice. He simply said the words that cut deeper than any blade. "You're alone, Mom. What else do you even need money for?" Something inside me shifted then, quietly, almost imperceptibly, but enough to crack the foundation of the woman I had been for 68 years. And as he pushed that folder closer to my trembling hands, I felt the first flicker of a truth I had never dared consider. This time, I wasn't sure I would stay. People like to imagine that mothers become weak overnight, that one day we simply wake up and let our children walk all over us. But that kind of surrender doesn't happen in a moment. It's shaped over years, quietly, patiently, the way water wears down stone. And for me, that erosion began long before Richard ever uttered the words $300,000. I married my husband, Edward, when I was 21. Young, romantic, and convinced that stability was the same thing as love. He was charming in public, responsible, and older by 9 years. People said I was lucky. I believed them. What I didn't understand then was that control rarely announces itself with a shout. More often, it starts with a gentle suggestion, then a firm opinion, then a rule disguised as concern. By the time I turned 30, nearly every financial decision in our household belonged to him. I didn't question it. That's just how marriage was in those days, or so I told myself. And he reinforced that belief often enough that I stopped noticing when my voice became optional. When I stopped having opinions altogether. Richard grew up watching this dynamic, his father as the unquestioned authority, me as the one who yielded. Children learn more from what we tolerate than what we teach. Richard adored Edward, idolized him, followed him like a shadow. And Edward rewarded that devotion, especially when Richard mimicked his habits, firmness over empathy, command over consideration, pride over humility. I should have seen the echoes forming in him even then. The distance between Richard and me began subtly. A skipped goodnight kiss. A snapped response. Little signs of a temper he'd inherited from his father. Edward brushed it off every time. "He's just strong-willed," he'd say. "A real man needs a hard edge." By the time Richard was a teenager, that hard edge had sharpened into something closer to entitlement. When he wanted money for something, Edward provided it instantly. When he got into trouble at school, Edward smoothed it over before I could even ask questions. Richard didn't learn consequences, he learned that manipulation worked. When Edward died 10 years ago, the world went quiet, and then unbearably loud. Suddenly the decisions fell to me, but I had no practice making them. The house, the bills, the legal documents. Edward had arranged everything in a way he insisted would protect us. In truth, it protected him while he was alive and left me dependent after he was gone. Even the house I lived in, my home, was still under Richard's name. Edward thought it would save time later. I didn't realize it meant I had no real security of my own. Grief made me pliable. Loneliness kept me that way. Richard visited often in the first year after the funeral, but never to talk about memories or comfort me. He came to discuss the business he inherited, to seek reassurance, or, on several occasions, to borrow money he never repaid. Each time, I told myself it was natural for a mother to help her son rebuild after losing his father. But over the years, his visits became less about bonding and more about expectation. He no longer asked how I was doing. He no longer lingered for tea. He came when he needed something, and he left the moment he had it. And I allowed it. Because part of me believed that if I finally said no, I would lose the only family I had left. Still, a small ache grew in me, something like the early tremors of an earthquake. A sense that I'd spent my entire life orbiting the needs of men who never once considered mine. My husband had shaped the mold, but Richard, my only child, had filled it perfectly. So when he sat at my kitchen table demanding $300,000, I wasn't shocked by the audacity. What shocked me was the realization that I'd spent 68 years preparing him to believe he had every right to ask. And that I had every obligation to obey. But even then, something deeper stirred in me, quiet but undeniable. A question I had never dared to ask aloud. When did being a mother become the same as being owned? That crack inside me widened just a little more. A warning of what was coming. That morning felt ordinary, sunlight slipping through the blinds, the smell of tea steeping on the stove, the quiet hum of my old refrigerator. I remember thinking it would be a peaceful day. I should have known better. In my life, peace has always been the warning before a storm. I heard the crunch of tires on gravel first. Richard never parked neatly, he stopped wherever was most convenient for him, and today was no different. Through the window I saw his luxury SUV pulled diagonally across the driveway, the engine still running. He hadn't even bothered to close the door properly. He didn't knock. He never knocked. "Mom," he called out as he walked in, already halfway down the hall before I could wipe my hands on a towel. I turned to greet him, instinctively expecting a hug, or at least a smile. But he brushed past me with nothing but a clipped kiss on the air near my cheek. "I don't have much time today," he said. His voice was taut, impatient. "We need to sit." He walked straight to the kitchen and took my chair, my spot, pulling out his phone before he even looked at me. My stomach tightened. Whenever Richard avoided eye contact, it meant he wanted something he knew I wouldn't want to give. "There's trouble," he finally said, thumbing through his messages as if the words weren't enough to shatter me. He reached into a brown envelope and slid out several papers. "Fernanda got caught up in a bad investment. It's complicated." I sat across from him, my fingers twisting in my lap. "How bad?" I whispered. He flipped the contract toward me. The number hit me like a blunt force to the chest. $300,000. I blinked, hoping I'd misread it. But the figure stared back, cruel and undeniable. "Richard," I said softly, "this is a mistake," he cut in sharply. "One she shouldn't have made, but here we are." He tapped the table with irritation. "And the people involved, they're not exactly patient." I felt the first tremor of fear. "Dangerous?" He shrugged in a way that chilled me. "It doesn't matter. What matters is that the payment is due tomorrow. We don't have time for lectures or emotions." I looked at him, really looked at him. His jaw clenched. His eyes restless. His hands gripping the coffee cup like he was holding himself together by force. But beneath it all was something darker: entitlement. Certainty. The conviction that I would fix this just as I'd fixed everything else in his life. "Richard," I tried again, "that's nearly everything I have." "You don't need it," he snapped. Then, softening artificially, "Mom, you live alone. The house is paid off. You're almost 70. What else do you even spend money on?" Each word was a blade sliding between my ribs. He stood up and began pacing. "I'm your only son. You always said you'd do anything for me. I'm asking you now. Not even for me. This is for Fernanda. For the kids." I swallowed hard. He always knew how to use love against me. When he finally stopped moving, he leaned on the back of the chair, towering over me. "We need the transfer today. Tomorrow will be too late. Don't let me down." There it was. The sentence that cracked something inside me open. The Richard the First had raised, the boy who once picked roses from the backyard and left them on my pillow, was nowhere in this room. Instead, a man stood before me who saw my life savings as nothing more than a convenient solution to his own recklessness. That was the moment I knew the ground beneath us had shifted. The day everything changed. The day I realized I couldn't keep living in the world I had helped create. After Richard left, the house went silent, so silent I could hear my heartbeat echoing in my ears. The envelope lay on the table like a living thing, pulsing with everything I feared, everything I'd allowed, everything I still didn't know how to escape. I poured myself a cup of tea, but my hands trembled so badly that most of it spilled onto the counter. I stared at the rising steam and asked the question I'd spent decades avoiding: how did I become someone my own child could demand $300,000 from without hesitation? I sank into my chair, the one he had taken so casually earlier, and forced myself to open the envelope again. Pages of numbers blurred together, loan agreements, overdue notices, interest rates that doubled every few months. Fernanda's name appeared again and again. She must have been terrified. Part of me ached for her. Another part wondered how long she'd known Richard planned to use me as a solution. A wave of guilt washed over me. Maybe I had failed somewhere along the way. Maybe I had shown Richard too much accommodation and not enough boundaries. Maybe I had taught him, without meaning to, that my pain was a price worth paying if it made his life easier. Still, he was my son. My only child. The last living link to the family I once had. And the thought of him facing danger, of my grandchildren being pulled into chaos, made my chest tighten until it hurt. What kind of mother walks away when her family is drowning? And then, a sharper thought cut through the fog. What kind of son pushes his mother underwater to keep himself afloat? I closed my eyes. Memories flickered behind them, Edward dismissing me, telling me I worried too much, telling me he'd take care of the important things. Years of handing over control. Years of silence. This wasn't the first time Richard had borrowed money. It wasn't even the fifth. And I had never seen a single dollar returned, nor a hint of remorse. Each time, the requests grew bigger. So did his confidence that I would never say no. And now he wanted everything. Everything I had left. Everything I had built to survive old age alone. I looked at the folder one more time, and for the first time in my life, fear took a step back and made room for something else, something sharper, something quietly rising. Clarity. If I gave him the money, this cycle would never end. If I didn't, he might never forgive me. Either way, nothing would ever be the same again. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at that envelope as if it might swallow me whole. Eventually, the sun dipped low enough to turn the kitchen a muted gold, and something inside me snapped. Not in anger, no. In awareness. In exhaustion. In the realization that I couldn't navigate this alone anymore. My hands moved before my mind caught up. I reached for the phone and scrolled until I found the number I hadn't dialed in years, Marjorie, my old college friend. The one person who always told me the truth, even when it hurt. The one who used to say, "Diane, you're smart. Stop pretending you're not." When she answered, her voice was warm, steady. "Diane? Is everything okay?" I didn't know where to begin. The words gathered in my throat like stones. But when they finally spilled out, about Richard, the debt, the deadline, the way he'd looked at me as if I owed him my life, Marjorie went silent. Not shocked. Not confused. Silent in that way people get when something they suspected is finally confirmed. $300,000, she repeated slowly. "Diane, that's everything you have." "I know." "And he expects you to give it?" I swallowed. "By tonight." Her sigh crackled through the speaker. "This isn't the first time, is it?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. "Diane," she said gently but firmly, "this is abuse. Financial abuse. Emotional abuse. And you've been living in it so long you think it's normal." Her words hit with the force of truth I'd been avoiding for decades. I clutched the phone tighter. "But he's my son. And you're his mother, not his wallet." Her tone hardened. "It's time to protect yourself. You have every right to live the rest of your life without fear." Something warm and painful rose in my chest, grief mixed with a strange, shaky hope. "What do I do?" I whispered. "You pack a bag," she said. "You take your documents, your medications, whatever matters most. And then you transfer the rest of your money somewhere Richard can't reach. I'll help you set it up." I almost laughed, shocked, disbelieving. "Marjorie, I can't just leave." "Yes," she said. "You can. And you need to do it before he returns." Her certainty steadied me like a hand on my spine. "Diane," she added softly, "you've spent your entire life taking care of everyone else. Let someone take care of you now." And in that moment, for the first time in years, I let myself consider what life might feel like if I finally stepped out of the shadow I'd been living under. Marjorie arrived faster than I expected, 30 minutes, maybe less. I remember hearing her knock, sharp and deliberate, and feeling my breath catch. Until that moment, everything still felt hypothetical, like a terrible dream I'd eventually wake from. But when I opened the door and saw her standing there with her briefcase in one hand and determination in her eyes, the dream hardened into reality. "Let's not waste time," she said, stepping inside. "He said he'd come back tonight?" I nodded. "For dinner. Then we have hours." "Enough, but not a minute more." Her efficiency snapped me into motion. She took the envelope from the table and flipped through it, muttering under her breath. I didn't look at the papers again. I couldn't. Seeing those numbers had already carved deep bruises inside me. "First, the bank," she said. "We'll transfer your money into an account Richard can't access. Then we'll set legal protections in place. After that, you leave." The word leave echoed through the kitchen. Leave my home. Leave my life. Leave my son. But also, leave the fear. Marjorie must have seen the conflict on my face, because she stepped closer and put a hand on my arm. Her voice softened. "You're not abandoning him. You're saving yourself." I nodded, more to steady myself than to agree. "Pack enough for a few weeks," she continued. "Essentials only. Documents. Medication. Jewelry you want to keep. Clothes. Sentimental things, if they matter." I walked up the stairs feeling like I was floating above my own body. Every step felt unreal, like I was trespassing in a life I had lived too quietly. I reached my bedroom and opened the closet, pulling out a small suitcase I hadn't used since Edward's funeral. Clothes went in mechanically, blouses, slacks, a sweater. Then my medications. A folder of personal documents. A few pieces of jewelry Edward never liked me wearing because he thought they were too flashy. I put them in the case anyway. When I opened the drawer of my nightstand, my hand paused over a framed photo of Richard as a little boy. His face glowed with innocent joy, the kind only children have before the world twists them into something else. My chest tightened. I sat on the bed, the frame cradled between my palms. I wanted to take it. I also wanted to leave it behind. In the end, I set it gently back in the drawer. Not out of spite. Out of grief. When I returned downstairs, Marjorie was on the phone with someone she called her contact at the bank. She hung up as soon as she saw me. They'll process everything quickly, she said. We'll handle the transfer, and they'll stop sending statements to your home address. I glanced at the suitcase by the stairs, small, worn, and suddenly the most precious possession I owned. It held not just clothes, but the first step toward a life I had never allowed myself to imagine. Before we left, I stood in the doorway of the kitchen one last time. The room looked exactly as it always had, the chipped tile, the floral curtains, the wooden table where Richard had placed that envelope just hours earlier. But somehow, it felt smaller now. As though the walls had shifted inward, revealing the truth I'd refused to acknowledge for years. This house had been my shelter, yes. But it had also been my cage. I picked up a note card from a drawer and wrote a single sentence. The one who disappointed you is me. This debt cannot be repaid with money. I placed the note on the table where he couldn't miss it. Then I grabbed my suitcase and stepped outside, expecting to feel terror. Instead, a strange calm settled over me, like the quiet before a sunrise. I wasn't running blindly. I was choosing, maybe for the first time in my life. In the car, as Marjorie drove us toward my new beginning, the world outside blurred into streaks of fading daylight. I pressed my palm to the window, watching the neighborhood I'd spent decades nurturing slip away behind me. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly. "No," I said, voice trembling. "But for the first time in years, I think I will be." And with that, I disappeared into the night, vanishing from a life that had long stopped feeling like my own. The first night in Marjorie's Florida condo felt unreal, too quiet, too bright, too free. I lay awake on the unfamiliar sofa bed, listening to the ocean murmuring outside the balcony doors. I'd expected relief to wash over me the moment I left my house behind, but instead I felt suspended between two worlds. One I had fled, and one I didn't yet know how to live in. By morning, my phone had erupted with notifications, missed calls, voicemails, messages. 17 attempts from Richard alone. 5 more from unknown numbers. A few from Fernanda. I stared at the screen without opening a single one. "Don't check them," Marjorie said, setting a mug of tea beside me. "Not yet. You need space before you let him back into your head." But curiosity gnawed at me. Guilt, too. I powered on the phone for only a moment before the messages flooded in so fast they seemed to vibrate the entire device. The first voicemail was Richard's voice, sharp, angry. "Mom, call me back. This isn't funny." The second was tighter. More desperate. "You left the house empty? What is this? Where are you?" The third was nearly a whisper. "Don't do this. You're making everything worse." I turned off the phone. My stomach twisted. Hearing his voice. Hearing that blend of irritation and entitlement reminded me exactly why I had left. Later that afternoon, Marjorie returned from a call with an update. "He went to your house. He saw the note." I swallowed. "And?" "He was furious. Confused. But mostly furious." She paused. "Diane, he's not worried about you. He's worried about losing his access to you." Those words settled heavily between us. I didn't respond. A few hours later, After I'd started unpacking my small suitcase into the condo's dresser, my phone buzzed again, this time a text from Fernanda. "Diane, are you safe? Please call me. Richard is losing control. I don't know what to do." My breath hitched. I pictured her thin hands fidgeting, her wide eyes darting as she tried to calm my grandchildren. Despite everything, compassion pulled at me. But Marjorie gently took the phone and set it face down. "You are not responsible for cleaning up Richard's destruction," she said softly. "Not anymore." The next day, Richard's calls slowed. Then stopped. A kind of silence settled, but not a peaceful one, more like the electric stillness before a storm. Every creak of the condo made me tense. Every knock made my heart jump. I wondered whether he was searching for me. Whether he was plotting. Whether he was finally realizing the truth. I wasn't coming home. On the third day, I walked to the balcony at sunrise. The ocean glowed a pale orange, and for a brief moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Possibility. The fear remained, but it no longer owned me. I wrapped my sweater around my shoulders, breathed in the sharp sea air, and let myself imagine something radical. A life that belonged to me. A life that didn't include apologizing for surviving. Richard had lost his access to me, yes. But I had gained something far more precious, myself. It was on the fifth morning of hiding that the knock came, 3 sharp raps that weren't Richard's, but carried the same weight of dread. Marjorie, already dressed for a call at her firm, stiffened. I stayed rooted to the floor. "Stay behind me," she whispered, and opened the door only a crack. A woman stood outside, holding a badge. Her expression was calm, professional, but her eyes carried something heavier, concern. "Mrs. Diane Miller?" she asked. My throat tightened. "Yes. I'm Detective Olivia Reyes with the Financial Crimes Division. We need to speak with you about your son." My legs went weak. She noticed and softened her tone. "May I come in?" Marjorie nodded and stepped aside. The detective sat on the edge of the sofa, notebook balanced on her knee, observing me with the patience of someone who has delivered difficult news many times before. "I'll get straight to it," she said. "Your son is under investigation for financial fraud, falsifying documents, and involvement with loan sharking networks." The room tilted slightly. I gripped the arm of the chair to steady myself. I didn't know," I whispered. "I thought he just had business problems." Detective Reyes opened a folder. "Mrs. Miller, we have reason to believe Richard may have used your identity to open accounts and transfer funds without your knowledge." My stomach dropped. "What?" The word escaped as a breath. "We found transactions in accounts under your name, accounts we suspect you were not aware existed." She paused. "We need to confirm which signatures are yours and which may have been coerced." Coerced. Such a clean word for something that had defined my life. I closed my eyes as memory surfaced. Documents Richard had rushed me to sign, papers he said were necessary to streamline the business, the way he'd hovered behind me until I finished scribbling my name. "I didn't know," I repeated softly. "I never read them." I trusted him. Detective Reyes nodded, not in judgment, but acknowledgement. That's why I'm here. You're not a suspect, Mrs. Miller. You're a potential victim. A victim. Hearing it spoken aloud cracked something inside me. I'd always known I was mistreated, but I had never considered that what I endured had a name. Why now? Marjorie asked beside me. Why come to her here? Because your son told several creditors that his mother, Mrs. Miller, would be paying the outstanding balance. When he couldn't reach her, pressure escalated. Her gaze sharpened. We're concerned for her safety. Cold dread crawled up my spine. Richard hadn't just expected my money, he'd used my name as a shield. Detective Reyes continued, we'll need an official statement from you, as well as confirmation of which transactions you approved. This will help us protect you legally and personally. I nodded, my voice barely present. I'll cooperate. She hesitated, then added, there's something else. We received a call from your daughter-in-law, Fernanda. She reported that the creditors have become increasingly aggressive. She believes Richard is hiding larger debts than the $300,000 he mentioned. That didn't surprise me. Somehow, it hurt more than the shock. She also said, the detective added gently, that Richard becomes volatile when discussing money. She and the children are frightened. I pressed a hand to my mouth. My grandchildren, scared. Because of the choices their father made. Choices rooted in the lessons he learned from a man who had taught control long before Richard ever wielded it. Detective Reyes closed her folder. We'll take your statement in a few days. In the meantime, do not contact your son. And if he tries to reach you, call us immediately. After she left, I sat in silence for a long time. Marjorie waited patiently beside me, letting me breathe, letting me unravel. He used my name, I whispered at last. He used me as collateral. Marjorie wrapped an arm around my shoulders. Yes, she said softly. But now the truth is out. I stared at the ocean outside the balcony, vast, open, unclaimed, and for the first time I understood the magnitude of what I'd escaped. Not just debt. Not just manipulation. But a life built on lies I had never meant to take part in. And now, whether I was ready or not, the law was finally pulling him into the light. The phone call came just after sunset, when the sky outside Marjorie's condo had turned the color of bruised lavender. I had been watching the ocean, letting the repetitive rush of the waves calm my nerves, when Marjorie stepped onto the balcony holding her phone in both hands. It's Fernanda, she murmured. You should listen. My heart tightened. I pressed the phone to my ear. Diane, Fernanda whispered, her voice quivering. Behind her, I could hear chaos. Shouting, objects breaking, a child crying. I didn't know who else to call. Richard, he's losing control. He found out someone reported him. The police are here now. They're taking him. The line crackled. A door slammed. Someone shouted Richard's name. Then the call cut off. I stood frozen, throat burning. Marjorie gently touched my arm. It's starting, she said. The investigation is catching up to him. Starting. As though the months, the years leading up to this moment had only been a prelude. 2 days later, Detective Reyes confirmed it formally. Your son has been arrested, she said, flipping through her notepad. Charges include fraud, identity misuse, and obstruction. He resisted at first, but he's now in custody. I exhaled shakily. I wasn't relieved. I wasn't heartbroken. I was suspended somewhere between grief and inevitability. The prosecution will likely call you as a key witness, she added gently. Your testimony will be essential. My testimony. Against my own child. I nodded. I'll do it. The weeks leading up to the trial blurred together, paperwork, statements, meetings with attorneys. Marjorie handled the legal logistics while I focused on something far harder, confronting the truth without looking away. On the morning of the preliminary hearing, I stood in front of the mirror, smoothing the wrinkles of my blouse. My hands trembled slightly. Not from fear of Richard, but from fear of seeing the remnants of myself reflected back at me. The courthouse was cold, its hallways lined with polished floors that echoed each step like a heartbeat. I felt small walking through them, as though I were moving through the skeleton of a life I'd never fully lived. Marjorie stayed by my side. When we entered the courtroom, I saw him. Richard sat between two officers, his wrists cuffed, his once expensive suit replaced by a gray uniform that drained the color from his face. But it wasn't the clothes that struck me, it was his expression. Hard. Unwilling. Angry enough to shatter the air between us. Our eyes met for a single moment. He didn't look guilty. He looked betrayed. When my name was called, the room fell silent. I walked to the witness stand, each step heavy but deliberate. After taking the oath, I sat down, folding my hands to stop them from trembling. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman with a calm presence, smiled encouragingly. Mrs. Miller, she began, can you describe your relationship with the defendant? I swallowed. I'm his mother. And over the years, did your son borrow money from you? Many times, I answered. Tens of thousands. He promised each time he would repay it. He never did. The prosecutor nodded. And regarding the recent request, he asked you for $300,000? Yes. What did he say to pressure you? I looked briefly at Richard. He looked away. He told me I didn't need the money. That I was alone. That I should give him everything I had left, for his safety, for his wife, for the children. My voice caught for a moment. He told me not to let him down. And how did that make you feel? How did it make me feel? Small. Forgotten. Used. But I said, softly, it made me feel like I was no longer his mother. Only his solution. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Mrs. Miller, the prosecutor continued gently, why did you leave your home after that conversation? Because if I stayed, I would have lost more than money. I would have lost myself entirely. Because I realized the situation would never end, I said. And because I was afraid. Afraid of what? Of my son, I whispered. Gasps. Even the judge's eyes softened. Richard's attorney approached with a stiff posture and a forced smile. Mrs. Miller, he began, do you consider yourself a good mother? The prosecutor started to object, but I raised my hand slightly. It's all right. I can answer. I looked directly at him. For most of my life, I believed a good mother gives everything she has. Now I understand that a good mother also teaches boundaries. He frowned. You abandoned your son when he needed you most. I stopped enabling him, I said firmly. There's a difference. He bristled, flipping his papers. These alleged threats, these claims you're making, convenient timing, wouldn't you say? I kept my gaze steady. There are recordings, I said simply. They speak for themselves. The courtroom erupted in whispers. The attorney paled. After hours of testimonies from employees, victims, and even Fernanda, her voice shaking as she described years of deceit, the judge returned. In the case of the state versus Richard Edward Miller, he said, the court finds the defendant guilty on all counts. My breath released in a slow, aching exhale. The sentence is 12 years in prison, the judge continued, with eligibility for parole after 4. Richard didn't look at the judge. He looked at me. This isn't over, he said quietly, venomously. And for the first time, I met his threat not with fear, but with clarity. I know, I whispered. But I'm no longer yours to control. As the officers led him away, I felt something inside me shift, not triumph, not relief, but a profound and painful acknowledgement. The boy I loved was gone long before today. And the man who remained no longer had power over me. In the weeks after the sentencing, something inside me shifted, slowly at first, like a stiff hinge easing open after years of neglect. For so long, my identity had been intertwined with serving others. Edward's wife, Richard's mother, the dependable woman who existed to fix, to soothe, to sacrifice. Now, for the first time in my life, I woke each morning with no one demanding anything from me. No footsteps pacing through my kitchen. No pressure to bend myself into shapes that weren't mine. Just silence. And strangely, possibility. The small apartment I rented near the beach wasn't grand, but it felt like mine the moment I stepped inside. Sunlight streamed through the sheer curtains each morning, painting soft ribbons across the floor. I bought potted plants, something Edward always said was a waste of money, and arranged them on the balcony. Their bright greens and blooming petals felt like small rebellions. Proof that life still grew, even in places that had once felt barren. On my first weekend alone, I visited a local craft fair. I wandered past booths filled with handmade jewelry, soaps, candles, until I noticed a group of older women selling embroidery. Their table was vibrant with color, birds, flowers, intricate patterns stitched so delicately they looked painted. Something in me stirred. I used to embroider when Richard was small, back before Edward convinced me it was childish and unproductive. One of the women must have seen the longing on my face. Do you stitch? She asked. Not in a long time, I admitted. Well, she smiled, it's never too late to start again. I bought a small kit that afternoon, a needle, thread, a piece of linen. When I sat on my balcony that evening and made the first stitch, a strange warmth blossomed in my chest. It felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd forgotten existed. Soon, stitching became my therapy. My hands moved with purpose, my mind softened. I created patterns inspired by the ocean, the rolling waves, the silver horizon, the shells scattered along the shore. When I brought a few pieces back to the craft fair, the women encouraged me to join them as a vendor. "You have a gift," one said, admiring a blue heron I'd stitched in delicate gradients. "People will love your work." To my surprise, they did. My pieces sold quickly. Not for much, but enough to give me a sense of independence I hadn't felt since I was a girl. Fernanda visited occasionally, bringing the children. I cooked simple meals, something I had avoided doing for years because Edward always criticized my cooking. But here, laughter replaced judgment. Lucas collected seashells with me, and little Mariana insisted on learning embroidery, her small fingers trying so earnestly to mimic mine. Watching them thrive in their new life, finally free from Richard's spiraling chaos, eased something in me. They were healing, just as I was. And as the days turned into weeks, I realized something profound. I was no longer defined by what I'd lost. I was defined by what I was building, quietly, steadily, thread by thread. For the first time in nearly 70 years, I was not living for someone else. I was learning how to live for me. Peace, I learned, is rarely permanent. It arrives in gentle waves, and sometimes it retreats just as quietly. For several months after the sentencing, my life began to settle into a calm rhythm: embroidery in the mornings, walks by the shore in the afternoon, calls with Fernanda and the children on weekends. I almost allowed myself to believe the storm had passed completely. Then the letter arrived. It was slipped under my apartment door, no return address, just my name written in Richard's familiar handwriting. My stomach tightened as I carried it inside. I hesitated for several minutes before unfolding the paper. "Mom, I know you think I deserve everything that's happened. Maybe I do. But I need your help. My new lawyer says a specialized defense team could reduce my sentence. I just need support, financial support. This time, it's different. This is my chance to fix things." He asked for $200,000. Below the request was a line meant to twist the guilt deeper. "We're still family. You can't turn your back on that." I set the letter down. My hands didn't shake this time. I wasn't the same woman who once feared disappointing him. Marjorie read the letter later that afternoon and let out a sharp exhale. "He doesn't understand boundaries," she said. "But you do now." I didn't respond. Instead, I folded the letter neatly and placed it in a drawer, not to revisit, but to remind myself how far I'd come. A few days later, Detective Reyes called. "Mrs. Miller," she began carefully, "we've intercepted communications suggesting Richard has been trying to hire someone to intimidate you. It seems he believed you would cooperate if pressured." A cold shiver ran through me. What? "We've taken the individuals into custody," she reassured. "You're not in danger. But this confirms a pattern of behavior we can use to deny parole in the future." I sank into a chair, breath thin. Even behind bars, Richard still reached for the same tools. Control, manipulation, threats. The detective continued speaking, but my mind drifted to a truth I had spent months avoiding. Some people mistake love for possession. And some never learn the difference. That night, I stepped out onto the balcony with a blanket around my shoulders. The ocean was dark and restless, waves rising and collapsing in silver foam. I watched them for a long time, letting their rhythm ground me. I felt fear, yes, but not paralysis. Not anymore. Richard could threaten, manipulate, and grasp at the remnants of the power he once had. But he no longer owned my life. He no longer defined my choices. And for the first time, I understood that freedom wasn't the absence of danger. It was the presence of courage. As the months passed, the chaos that once dominated my life slowly settled into a quiet clarity. There were no more abrupt letters from Richard, no anonymous threats, no looming dread when I checked my mail or glanced out the window. The world didn't become perfect, but it finally became mine. One morning, as I sat on the balcony with my embroidery hoop in hand, I watched the sun rise over the ocean, streaking the sky with soft gold. The waves moved in a steady rhythm, constant, patient, forgiving. It struck me how much my life had begun to resemble them, still carrying memories of past storms, but no longer defined by them. I thought about Richard often, not with the sharp pain that once consumed me, but with a quiet ache. The truth was simple: I loved him. I always would. But loving someone doesn't mean forfeiting yourself. It doesn't mean allowing their brokenness to become your prison. For decades, I believed endurance was the same as devotion. That suffering silently was a mother's duty. But distance has a way of revealing more than closeness ever can. I finally saw the truth. I had spent most of my life shrinking so others could feel bigger. And now, at nearly 70, I was learning to expand again. I found joy in small routines, teaching embroidery to a few local women, sharing tea with neighbors, visiting the craft fair every Saturday. The simple act of choosing how to spend my day felt revolutionary. The peace that came from belonging solely to myself felt like air after years underwater. Fernanda and the children became regular parts of my life, each visit filled with laughter rather than tension. The kids called my apartment their happy place, and every time they said it, something inside me healed a little more. Sometimes, late at night, I wondered whether Richard was changing. Whether the walls of his cell forced him to confront the consequences he had always avoided. Whether he recognized the pattern that had swallowed him whole, one he inherited but ultimately chose to continue. But I learned to let those questions rest in silence. They were no longer mine to carry. What mattered was this: I had broken a cycle. I had reclaimed a life I thought was over. I had finally learned what freedom felt like, not loud or triumphant, but quiet and steady, like a heartbeat rediscovered. And I promised myself I would never lose it again. If you had told me years ago that I would find peace at nearly 70, I would have laughed. Or cried. Or both. But here I am. Living quietly by the ocean, stitching my stories into cloth instead of burying them in silence, learning every day that it's never too late to choose yourself. My journey wasn't graceful. It wasn't easy. It certainly wasn't expected. But it was necessary. And if my story has taught me anything, it's this: you can rebuild your life at any age. You can walk away from pain, even when it comes from the people you love most. And you can step into a future that belongs to you, not to anyone else's demands. If parts of my story resonated with you, if you've ever felt trapped, overlooked, or taken for granted, I hope you found a bit of strength here. A bit of clarity. A reminder that you are allowed to begin again. And if you'd like to hear more stories of courage, healing, and hard-won freedom, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps these stories reach the people who may need them most. Thank you for listening, truly. Here's to new beginnings, at any age.